Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm diving into a video by everyone's favorite befuddled grandpa of a creationist, Mike Riddle. This time he responds to some evolutionists responding to a video of his that I responded to, so now I'm responding to his response to other responses, or something like that. Anyway, let's go.
Now, in this session, I would like to cover 7 of the objections used by evolutionists to my previous session on why the origin of life is a showstopper to evolution. And we'll start with objection number 1, and I call it probability. In a recent email I received from a gentleman, he objected to my use of probability, saying it was basically nonsense.
I'm inclined to agree. It was nonsense. I mean, first off, we can't really calculate the probability of life beginning without supernatural intervention because we only have one example of life beginning. And actually, and I'm sure the mathematician section of my audience might cringe here with my basic understanding of probabilities, but if we only have one instance of an event, and that event happened, doesn't that make the probability of that event happening equal to 1, or 100% likely? My point is that the dataset is not large enough to make any meaningful calculations with, and since Mike here has a Master's of Science in Mathematics, I have to assume that he knows this very basic stuff.
Now, here was his response, and I quote, "I have to go and pick up my wife from work every day. There are 34 traffic lights between our home and her work. At each light, I was able to drive through it or stop. For the round trip today, the probability of the exact sequence of events on that drive, stop, or go was over 1 chance in 29 quadrillion, or 29 followed by 18 zeros. A mathematical impossibility. Does that mean the trip home didn't happen? After all the chances of those traffic lights working the way they did was mathematically impossible. But wait, I did make it home. How is that possible? It's possible because we live in a world where mathematical impossibility happens all the time. Walking out to the mailbox, the birth of a child, and a trip out of town. Mathematical probability is just silly." Well, what was my response to him? Well, first of all, his response falls short of the problem. He oversimplified the problem.
You're accusing somebody else of oversimplifying something? That's rich. Let's see where you take this.
The origin of life by natural processes is a far more complex problem than he has made it. Let me give you just 5 reasons why. Reason number 1, 29 followed by 18 zeros is not considered mathematically impossible. The law of large numbers tells us that 1 followed by 50 zeros approaches mathematical impossibility. So his number was far too small.
Really? Okay, when I saw you had a Master's of Science in Math, I didn't really question it. That does sound like the kind of qualification that a creationist might have. But now I'm starting to wonder what institution you got your MS from, because the law of large numbers simply points out that in probability, the average results of large numbers of trials should be close to the expected value. So for example, when rolling a fairly balanced 6-sided die, each number has a 1 in 6 chance of being rolled. Each roll of the die is a trial. When dealing with small numbers of trials, it is possible that some numbers will be rolled more than others, but the more trials you conduct, the more it will even out. For instance, I just rolled a die 6 times. Since each number is equally likely to appear, each number should show up once, right? Well, I rolled 5, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2. This is not what is statistically expected. From this small sample, it looks like I'll roll a 2 half the times I roll this die. But if I increase the sample size, let's roll it 60 times. With 6 numbers, there should be around 10 rolls for each number. I rolled 14 1s, 11 2s, 13 3s, 7 4s, 7 5s, and 8 6s. This isn't quite the nice even split of 10 of each number, but if my beginning trend were to be continued, I would expect to have rolled 32s, and the more times I roll the die, the closer it will get to matching up with the probabilistic expectation. Nowhere in this law does it say that something approaches mathematical impossibility once you get to a certain probability. Now, one of the mathematicians who first described this law was named Emile Borel. Borel does appear to be the source of this anything with odds less than 1 in 10 to to the 50th are mathematically impossible idea, because he once wrote a book that described when you might consider something as having such a small probability as to be negligible. It is described as being a general rule of thumb, and on top of that, it's a sliding scale, with the number being different depending on whether you're talking about a human scale or a cosmic scale or anything in between, with 10 to the 50 being on the cosmic scale. And he actually spent a paragraph near the end of the book explaining why his rule of thumb should not be applied to things like the origin of life.
Secondly, the traffic lights he went through are programmed when to go red and green. In the evolution model, there is no intelligent programming allowed, just random chances. So again, he had the wrong problem here.
Okay, let me fix it for him then. I can prove right now that it is not only possible to perform examples of these statistically impossible feats, but it is ridiculously easy to do so. Let me just grab my 10-sided die and roll it 51 times. I'm not going to waste time reading the sequence out to you, but whatever sequence it is, has odds of happening of 1 in 10 to the 51st power. That's an order of magnitude less likely than what you are claiming makes something statistically impossible. No programming required, just random chance.
Number 3, in the origin of life problem, every time a wrong amino acid is used, the protein is no longer functional, and the process must start all over. In his situation with the traffic lights, every time he hit a red light, he would have to start all over again. I doubt that he did this. If he did, he probably would not be home even yet.
Nope, that is not how it would have worked. Now keep in mind here that we actually don't know for sure how abiogenesis happened, but one thing is fairly certain. It would not have been one lone chain of amino acids sitting in a pool waiting for the next amino acid to show up. There probably would have been billions, perhaps even hundreds of billions of amino acids floating around, and the ones that worked would have continued to float around. Since we're dealing with chemical reactions here, the ones that didn't work would have just not worked. The ones that did work would have continued on. We have demonstrated several times that all the ingredients needed for life could have formed by themselves in the conditions that would have been found on the early Earth. Not only that, but they could have formed in several different environments that would have been found on the early Earth, such as deep-sea hydrothermal vents, in pools on the surface, and even in outer space to be delivered to Earth via asteroid or meteor impact. Now, considering how abundant these life-forming resources would have been, to look at this on an individual level, saying that each potentially life-forming molecule would have had to completely disassemble and start over if it didn't get it right, is more than a bit misleading. To continue with the traffic light analogy, have the lights change at random intervals rather than pre-programmed ones, and have a few 100 billion people start driving that route at staggered times, and eventually one of those few 100 billion people will make it through by hitting all the green lights.
Number 4. In the real world, there are hundreds of different amino acids. Only 20 of these are used, and they all must be left-handed.
Only 20 of these are used for life as we know it. It is entirely possible that other combinations of amino acids could have been used, and we don't know how many of those other combinations would have been able to result in life, because there are so many different possibilities. Scientists are actually working on this, and so far have a list of 4,000 amino acids and their isomers that could potentially have been used for life, which they actually narrowed down from an original set of 120,000. Yes, there are only about 500 naturally occurring amino acids. Sometimes it is an isomer of an amino acid, which are molecules with the same chemical formula, but a different physical structure. So for each amino acid, there are also isomers of that acid that would potentially work. What it all boils down to is that the 20 amino acids that are used in life as we know it are not a necessity. It could have turned out thousands of different ways. And if it had turned out differently, you'd still be here complaining that only 36 of the 500 amino acids that are used for life, or whatever number it ended up being. You're looking at how it turned out, declaring that that is the only way, and then stating how amazing it is that it turned out that way, when there are literally thousands of other ways that it could have turned out. Same with your whole left versus right-hand molecules. Left-handed amino acids will only continue to form chains with other left-handed ones, so any right-handed ones would just terminate the chain, meaning that chains of left-handed ones just happen to be the ones that ended up working. But if it had started with right-handed ones, then it would only be right-handed ones. Now, at least on Earth, there does seem to be a tendency for the production of left-handed molecules over right-handed ones, and the reason for this is not entirely understood, but ultimately it comes down to the same thing. If the tendency was for right-handed molecules, we'd be having the opposite discussion.
In his situation with the traffic lights, he only included two choices, red lights and green lights. In order to match the real world, he would have to include hundreds of different colors of traffic lights, and only the green one allows him to go forward.
Actually, it would be thousands of different colors, with potentially thousands of colors allowing forward movement. Combine that with the hundreds of billions of people we have running this traffic light obstacle course, and it's looking more and more likely that at least one of them will make it to the end without having to stop.
Now let's go to objection 2 used by evolutionists about the origin of life. And their statement is, the origin of life has nothing to do with evolution.
It's not that it has nothing to do with evolution, it's that we know life is here, and we know that life evolves. It is evident that life began at some point. How life began is ultimately irrelevant to the theory of evolution. You can say that God put those molecules together by hand, and that's explained in the metaphor of Adam being formed from the dust of the ground, if you like. But ultimately, we know with reasonable certainty that life on Earth had a beginning. We are investigating the beginning and trying to figure out how it happened. To say that knowing how life originated is essential to the theory of evolution is like saying that a blacksmith has to understand how to mine for ore before he could possibly be able to work with the refined metal. Yes, the mining for ore is rather important to the overall smithing process, but you don't need to understand how it works in order to study blacksmithing.
Well, if this is true, that the origin of life has nothing to do with evolution, then we have to change all our biology textbooks, including the one he authored. Because in every one of these biology textbooks, there's sections on the origin of life.
Hey, do you know what other section I found in a biology textbook? The musculoskeletal system. Since there are organisms that don't have a musculoskeletal system, it can be inferred that evolution can happen without such a system, which means that the musculoskeletal system itself has nothing to do with evolution. Yet there's a section on it in biology textbooks. This is why I didn't like how you phrased it. It's not that it has nothing to do with it, it's that the details of how it happened are irrelevant with respect to the theory of evolution. The fact that textbooks have sections explaining current ideas about the origin of life does not therefore mean we have to fully understand the origin of life before evolution can be true.
You see, that statement by evolutionists is just another statement to avoid answering the question, how did life originate by naturalistic processes?
And that statement made by you is just a god of the gaps. We don't quite have a full answer on abiogenesis yet, therefore it couldn't possibly have happened, therefore God did it.
Now let's go to objection number 3 by evolutionists to the origin of life. And their statement is this: scientists will figure out how life originated in the future. Folks, this is nothing more than just a hopeful statement or an attempt to fill in the gaps.
Well, no, it's not so much an objection as it's pointing out that your questioning of the origin of life is simply a god of the gaps. Go back to when we didn't understand lightning. You could have been making these same arguments in favor of Thor being the source of lightning. Understanding how lightning works is essential to the study of meteorology. We don't fully understand where it comes from, and anyone saying we'll figure it out in the future is just making a hopeful statement in an attempt to fill in the gaps. You're attempting to flip the logical fallacy around, but really nobody accepts evolution on the grounds that they think science will probably figure out abiogenesis at an undetermined date in the future. This is just a response to creationists claiming that our lack of understanding on the origin of life is somehow damning to the well-understood theory of evolution.
It is no different than stating in the future everyone will believe in a creator God. If we can't teach that in the schools, then how in the world can we teach the origin of life? Because it is nothing more than a faith belief system.
There are plenty of differences between those two statements. For one, abiogenesis is not being taught as a dogmatic you must believe this or you'll be tortured for eternity kind of way. It is taught as an explanation of our current understanding. It is subject to revision as our understanding improves. We have every reason to expect that our understanding will continue to improve. We may never fully understand it, but at least we're trying to figure it out. And to top it all off, we do not teach about abiogenesis in school because we're convinced that we'll figure it out in the future. We teach what we understand about it today. If you replace that with teaching God did it, then that will stifle the curiosity that will lead us to a better understanding in the future.
Now let's go to objection 4 by evolutionists, and they state, life originated billions of years ago, and that gives plenty of time for all life forms to evolve. Well, dating the origin of life to a time of billions of years ago doesn't help explain how life did originate through naturalistic processes.
You're kinda right. Us finding evidence of life existing 3.5 billion years ago does not explain how that life got there. But what it does do is help narrow down the possible environments that this life could have developed in. We can use our knowledge of the environments of the Earth 3.5 billion years ago to inform the setup of our experiments that test the various aspects of abiogenesis.
Let's go to objection number 5. And they state, life on Earth was seeded from outer space.
I'm skipping this bit, it's completely irrelevant. It is possible that the building blocks of life did come to us from meteors, after all they have been found on recent meteors, but Mike is mostly referring to aliens, as if the people who seriously proposed panspermia from advanced aliens somehow forgot that those aliens had to come from somewhere. He does briefly mention the building blocks of life coming from asteroids or meteors rather than aliens, but he still maintains that this is just pushing the question back another step, completely ignoring the fact that the building blocks of life have been found on meteors, so this is an entirely plausible scenario.
Now, let's go to objection 6 by evolutionists to the origin of life. And their statement is this: life is just chemicals coming together.
I mean, that is a drastic oversimplification, but yeah, life essentially does boil down to a bunch of chemical reactions.
Folks, this is a scientifically inaccurate statement. Life is not just chemicals, and I hope no biology teacher on this planet would ever make that statement, because it is a lie. It is not education.
Okay, then please present something that is essential to life that is not based on a chemical reaction somehow.
You see, the key to life is not chemicals, it is information. Without information, there can be no life.
Are you talking about the information that is stored in the genetic code that is made up of 3 basic chemical components? Phosphates, deoxyribose sugars, and the nitrogenous bases? And this information that is completely meaningless and would do absolutely nothing were it not for the chemical reactions that take place during transcription and translation? That information? Are you really dense enough to claim that genetic information is somehow not based on chemicals? You know, the chemical deoxyribonucleic acid that stores all our genetic information?
Even Richard Dawkins, one of the leaders in the evolutionist movement, knows this. And he makes this statement: there is enough information capacity in a single cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over.
Yes, information that means nothing without the chemical reactions required to read it.
Then he goes on to make this statement: the difference between life and non-life is a matter not of substance, but information.
I am actually in the process of reading that book right now, but I haven't quite gotten there yet. But allow me to turn ahead and take a look. Okay, so it looks like what Dawkins was talking about in that chapter was the old idea that life is based on some form of mysterious vital essence. Let's read what he wrote. Life, it seemed, was made of a special living substance, a witch's brew called protoplasm, and continuing on, right up until the middle of the 20th century, life was thought to be qualitatively beyond physics and chemistry. No longer. The difference between life and non-life is a matter not of substance, but of information. So unsurprisingly, when we read this in context, Dawkins is actually saying rather the opposite of what you're claiming here. When Dawkins is talking about information, he's talking about the chemical encoding of information as DNA, as opposed to a mysterious protoplasmic substance that science would never be able to understand. Is life beyond physics and chemistry? He makes it quite clear. It was once thought to be, but no longer. We can quibble with whether or not he should have used the word information here, but he is without a doubt stating that life is, in fact, a matter of physics and chemistry. Also, I like how you presented that as if those sentences were right next to each other when they were actually separated by 23 years.
Now let's go to the final objection by evolutionists, and they call it the RNA first world.
It's actually the RNA world hypothesis, but that's a fairly minor quibble. This isn't an objection to creationism or an answer to questions that creationists pose. It is simply one of the hypotheses about how the first self-replicating molecules could have developed. There's also the Foldamer hypothesis, where proteins would have been the first molecules that life was based on.
Some evolutionists have theorized that RNA was the first molecule.
No, stop. You apparently don't know what a molecule is. Nobody says that RNA was the first molecule. The first molecule was most likely helium hydride when the universe was young and mostly made of helium and hydrogen. As far as firsts are concerned, in the RNA world hypothesis, it is that RNA would have been the starting point for the storing of genetic information. This is because RNA is essential to protein synthesis with DNA, but RNA by itself is capable of both storing information and acting as a catalyst for protein synthesis. So for DNA to have come first, RNA would have had to already be available for the DNA to utilize, but in an RNA world, all you need is RNA to get started.
And that it could perform the functions of proteins and DNA.
Fun fact, RNA is actually capable of folding up on itself and acting like a protein all by itself. That's just another little tidbit that makes the RNA world hypothesis just a little bit more robust.
But what they failed to mention to their students, and what has failed to be brought out in the textbooks, is that there are many scientific problems to an RNA first world. First, RNA is a very complex molecule.
Yeah, it is, and nobody is suggesting that RNA by itself just popped out of nowhere. It obviously would have had to have been constructed from resources available on the early Earth.
Zach, next, the components of RNA, the nucleotides, are very complex and have not been produced in any so-called primordial soup or anywhere in a laboratory. That makes this whole statement a faith statement.
That is a bit of an issue, but not as much as you're making it out to be. Though I will forgive you for this one, your video was published in 2015, and it wasn't until 2016 that researchers at the Georgia Institute of Technology published the results of their experiment which identified nitrogen-containing heterocycles that spontaneously react with ribose 5-phosphate in water to form nucleotides. Although upon further research, I have found that a different experiment published in 2009 was able to synthesize ribonucleotides in prebiotically plausible conditions, so my forgiveness is hereby formally withdrawn. That was short-lived.
Next, spark chamber experiments, like the famous Miller experiment, do not produce the necessary components of RNA.
The Miller-Urey experiment wasn't trying to. They were trying to produce amino acids, and they did. That complaint is like getting mad at the cattle breeder because the butcher didn't cut your meat properly. Yes, the cow had to start out at the breeding farm, but the farmer had nothing to do with the cutting of your meat and likely wouldn't know how to properly butcher a cow if you asked them. Miller and Urey were trying to produce amino acids, not nucleotides. Amino acids make up proteins. Proteins are coded by DNA and RNA. DNA and RNA are made up of nucleotide bases. In order for protein synthesis to work, amino acids have to be available when transcription and translation occur. So to complain that an experiment that was meant to determine if amino acids would have been available on the prebiotic Earth didn't result in nucleotides is nonsensical.
And RNA, folks, is less stable than DNA and proteins.
Yep, that is one of the legitimate problems with the RNA world hypothesis. We haven't quite figured out a way around that one yet. So I guess insert God into this gap?
It breaks apart rather quickly. See, the simpler components of RNA, like the ribose, are very unstable in abiotic environments, meaning no living chemicals. The half-life of ribose is about 44 years. Far too short for any evolution to take place. Why don't they talk about these situations?
That's actually only applicable at a pH of 7 and at a temperature of 0 Celsius. It gets even shorter when the temperature goes up. At 100 Celsius, it's only 73 minutes. This is certainly detrimental to the RNA world hypothesis, and is one of the reasons it's still just a hypothesis. Let me now read from the conclusion of the paper that provided this half-life. The above results show that the stability considerations preclude the use of ribose and other sugars as prebiotic reagents except under very special conditions. It follows that ribose and other sugars were not components of the first genetic material, and other possibilities such as the peptide nucleic acids and other non-sugar-based backbones should be examined. This by no means wipes out the RNA world hypothesis, and further research has provided potential solutions to this problem, but it is not just some ignored problem that is swept under a rug in an attempt to keep it secret. It's something that is being actively researched. This is simply another point at which the current answer is we don't know, and you're trying to shove God into this tiny hole in our knowledge instead of accepting that we are actively trying to find the correct answer. That's it for today. The rest of his video is just a few more quote mines and him explaining what he thinks the reasons are that evolutionists continue to believe in evolution. And in a surprise to no one, it all boils down to a belief in evolution in order to reject the existence of God. Which is simply not the case. Just go ask the people over at BioLogos, whose mission statement is, BioLogos invites the church and the world to see the harmony between science and biblical faith as we present an evolutionary understanding of God's creation. The existence of an organization such as BioLogos completely debunks his idea that an acceptance of evolution is automatically a rejection of God. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Gary Avey. I'm ignoring the first bit because it's just the boring old argument that the Bible says there's evidence for God, therefore there's evidence for God even though I can't show you any outside of the Bible. So the last bit is as follows, and forgive me if I inflect this somewhat incorrectly. He didn't use any punctuation, so I'm not entirely sure how he was meaning this to come across, but this is how I read it. Farmers do not use evolution for grain produce yields. That is not evolution. The wheat seed is still a wheat seed. I'm going to stray from his example of wheat because it's not as obvious as it is with other plants, so I'll go with wild mustard. The wild mustard plant is the ancestor of several different vegetable crops, including broccoli, cabbage, turnips, kale, cauliflower, and kohlrabi. This variety was created by human farmers selecting for different traits. Now I ask you, Gary, is a broccoli seed still a mustard seed? And now I'll give you an answer that you might actually like. Cladistically speaking, yes, it is. The broccoli family is a clade within the mustard clade. But it is not a kale seed. Those are two separate clades, two different kinds that diverged from the mustard kind. So remember to follow me on Twitter and Facebook and support me on Patreon. See you next time. Extra super special thanks this week goes out to Shalom Jacobovitz, whose very generous PayPal donation will keep the beer fridge well stocked for quite a while.